Continuing now with The Final Days by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. In this session, we begin Chapter 20. On Friday, July 12th, the House Judiciary Committee released its evidence, 3,888 pages. In stark chronological fashion, Dorr and his staff had cataloged without commentary the abuses of power in the Nixon White House. The front pages were filled with damning excerpts. By noon, Jerry Warren was besieged. Already that morning, St. Clair had said publicly that he expected the committee to vote to impeach. It was the first such acknowledgement by the White House. What was the president's assessment? Reporters shouted at Warren. The president said Warren also expected the committee to report a bill of impeachment. The reporters ran to the phones. A few minutes later, Ziegler was at the podium to soften the impact. The president recognizes that this is a political process, and he would not be surprised by a committee vote against him, Ziegler said. He does feel strongly that the House will not vote impeachment. At 4 o'clock, the president took off aboard Air Force One for what the White House described as a working vacation at the Western White House. He had been airborne for scarcely an hour when more bad news arrived. John Ehrlichman had been found guilty of conspiring to violate the civil rights of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist, and of 3 additional counts of lying to the FBI and the grand jury. Aboard the plane, Ziegler was getting more details from his aides back in the Washington press office, who wanted to know what to tell reporters. He didn't know. Check the files, he directed. See what the response had been when other members of the staff had pleaded guilty or gone to jail or been convicted. In Washington, the staff found a statement issued in the president's name after the conviction of Dwight L. Chapin, his former appointments secretary. It expressed Nixon's concern and feelings for Chapin's family. Ehrlichman's name was substituted and the statement reissued. Leon Jaworski was making preparations. Not even his most trusted staff was fully aware of his intentions. He called his friend from LBJ days, Joseph Califano. The subject was so important he needed to test the alternatives on an old hand. Jaworski knew that Califano was in touch with Haig. For months, the general and the prosecutor had each used Califano to sound things out. Jaworski was now sure that the president was in trouble so deep that he would not be able to get out of it. Once Nixon saw his situation more clearly, things might change overnight. Even the proudest man would not make a deal when his back was to the wall. It was not at all inconceivable that Richard Nixon would soon be ready to plea bargain. I'm going to back up here. I misstated that. I knew that didn't sound right. Even the proudest man, once Nixon saw his situation more clearly, things might change overnight. Even the proudest man would make a deal when his back was to the wall. It was not at all inconceivable that Richard Nixon would soon be ready to plea bargain. Jaworski was ready to discuss the terms. There was no area more sensitive for the prosecutor. The only public criticism that had been leveled against him had been for allowing some of Nixon's men to plead guilty to reduced charges. What could the president trade? Could Jaworski ask him to give up his office? Did anyone have the right to ask that of a president? Would the special prosecutor be interfering in the impeachment process? Could Jaworski insist on getting Nixon's testimony against the other cover-up defendants? The president turning state's evidence, it sounded ludicrous. Should Jaworski make the first overture? How could he let them know he was ready to deal? Jaworski wanted to look at the national interest in the broadest sense. He thought it was important to finish Watergate as quickly as possible. His inclination was to let the president bargain his office away. It would save the country an ordeal and end the uncertainty. Haig's comments of late were unusually disturbing. Haig had indicated to Jaworski that the president was unstable, in fact, out of control. This was a time, Haig had told him, when the real national interest, perhaps the real national security, was most at stake. But there was another factor. Jaworski was convinced that he could never bring Nixon to trial. The House would vote impeachment, and the Senate would convict. The trial of the cover-up defendants would begin in the fall. With all the resulting publicity, it would be impossible to give Nixon, a former president, a fair trial. By plea bargaining, Jaworski would not be giving much away. It was a very hypothetical discussion. Jaworski and Califano reviewed the issues, the priorities, the questions of fairness and equal justice. Jaworski had no alternative but to await developments, Califano suggested. They agreed to keep in touch. That Tuesday, July 16th, Senators Scott and Mansfield met in the minority leader's office. They agreed that preparation for a Senate trial should begin immediately. Ken Davis, Scott's aide, was directed to start the machinery. A committee on procedures was to be formed. Tickets were to be printed. The television networks were to be contacted secretly to make arrangements for live coverage. St. Clair was preparing for the final arguments that he was to deliver before the House Judiciary Committee on July 18th. On the evening before his presentation, he dined with several members of his staff at Jenkins Hill, a restaurant a few blocks from the Judiciary hearing room. They reviewed the situation. What did Hauser do about that transcript? St. Clair asked McCahill. It's ready, McCahill replied. Get him on the get him on the phone and tell him to bring it up here, St. Clair directed. Hauser appeared shortly afterward. The transcript was 2.5 pages long, a portion of a conversation between Nixon and Haldeman on the morning of March 22nd, 1973. St. Clair was still trying to extricate the president from the charge that he approved the $75,000 hush money payment. There was one line in the transcript that he wanted to get into the record, 2 sentences from the president to Haldeman. Quote, I don't mean to be blackmailed by Hunt. That goes too far, end quote. It looks pretty good to me, St. Clair concluded. Larry Speaks, St. Clair's press aide, thought otherwise. The snippet came from a subpoenaed conversation which the president had withheld from the committee. Presenting the transcript at this late date would be a public relations disaster, Speaks felt. But St. Clair was a $300,000 a year lawyer, and he must know what he was doing. Speaks kept his advice to himself. Malcolm J. Howard, another of St. Clair's assistants, was equally concerned, but he cautioned against arguing with St. Clair. Once Jim's got his mind made up, that's it, he said. The next morning, St. Clair was having second thoughts. Riding with Speaks and Howard to the Hill, he said he was not sure it was a good idea to introduce the transcript. I don't know. His voice trailed off. Speaks saw the opening. Well, Mr. St. Clair, I think. Howard, sitting between them in the back seat, shoved an elbow into Speaks's ribs, and the sentence went unfinished. Rodino called the session to order at 10:25 a.m. St. Clair, expecting to begin his presentation immediately, was surprised when the chairman called on Dorr for several last-minute items of business. Dorr told the committee that the president had rejected its latest subpoena for tapes. The committee had also asked the White House for Ehrlichman's handwritten notes of his meetings with the president. In his solemn monotone, Dorr described how, in a mix-up, the committee had received 2 sets of Ehrlichman's notes. One from St. Clair consisted of 175 pages, 88 of them blank. There were 643 lines of notes. The version of the same material that the special prosecutor's office had obtained from the White House contained twice as many lines of notes. St. Clair fumed as Dorr let the committee arrive at the conclusion that he was intentionally withholding relevant material. He had already told Dorr that it was a simple mix-up, that there was no deception intended on his part. Bazart's heart attack had left St. Clair confused as to what had already been provided to whom. He resented this sour prelude to his own presentation. At last, Rodino called on him to offer his final argument. St. Clair spoke from very few notes, almost extemporaneously, his manner cordial, even friendly. His attention was focused on the 2 tiers of seats where the members sat. I think I would be less than candid if I didn't indicate to you the enormity of the responsibility that I feel in regard to this matter, representing the President of the United States. But the enormity of the committee's responsibility to make a decision was even greater, he said. A vote to impeach could be justified only by evidence that was, quote, clear and convincing. quote, because anything less than that, in my view, is going to result in recrimination, bitterness, and divisiveness among our people, and this will not be good for the United States of America. There was really just one allegation of criminality against the president to warrant impeachment, St. Clair suggested: the payment of hush money to Hunt. Mr. Dean set in motion the events that resulted in payments of Mr. Hunt's attorney fees, and I submit he could have gone out and played tennis rather than meet with the president on the morning of March 21st, and the same result would have happened. Since the president didn't order or authorize the payment, then the only question left, St. Clair said, was whether or not the president knew it had been made. He would prove that the president had not known. The president has authorized me to distribute to and disclose to this committee a portion of a transcript of a conversation he had with Mr. Haldeman on the morning of March 22nd. Keep in mind now, this is the president on the morning of March 22nd with Mr. Haldeman. And he says, among other things, "I don't mean to be blackmailed by Hunt. That goes too far." End quote. There were furious objections to the introduction of this new 11th hour evidence, but Rodino cut off the protests and asked St. Clair to continue. How had the president responded to Dean's revelation of March 21st? His decision was not a flash of light, St. Clair said, but it came. By the end of April, Richard Nixon had obtained the written resignations of Dean, Ehrlichman, and Haldeman. The lawyer's cadence became more rapid. Was there an obstruction of justice? No. All testified before the Senate committee freely. All testified before the grand jury. There was a new attorney general, a special prosecutor. The president urged Mr. Dean to tell the truth. He urged Mr. Magruder to purge himself of perjury. He told Mr. Mitchell, a pause, this part was more difficult, the president was preparing to let the chips fall where they may, that Mr. Mitchell should not keep quiet on his account. And ultimately, all of these gentlemen were indicted by a grand jury and are now prepared to stand trial on these issues. So that if you want to judge the pudding by the eating, the process has worked. Maybe it should have worked days earlier. I don't know. I don't pretend perfection on my part or even on the part of the president. I am sure that if every time our associates were charged with wrongdoing, we fired them, we would never have anybody work for us. What would you have done that was substantially different? If there was a delay in terms of days, was there any real prejudice developed for the people of the United States by reason of that delay? When he had concluded, a storm of protest again erupted over St. Clair's introduction of a new transcript. It was only 2.5 pages, whereas the conversation had lasted an hour and 24 minutes, and all of the conversation was under subpoena. And in a footnote, they add, the transcript also quoted the president as saying in reference to Hunt, that judge gave him 35 years. The sentencing of the Watergate bugging conspirators did not take place until March 23rd. The day after the purported date of the transcript, and Hunt had indeed received a provisional sentence of 35 years. Thus it appeared the president was commenting on an event that had not taken place. Disclosure of the contradiction cast doubt on the validity of the transcript itself, and the House committee opened an investigation into the matter, which was never resolved. St. Clair promised to pass the members' objections along to the president. That it was only 2.5 pages, the transcript, whereas the conversation lasted an hour and 24 minutes, and all the conversation was under subpoena. I want to thank you very much for having been as courteous as you have been, Rodino told St. Clair, and we appreciate the fact that you have had a very, very difficult time, and we excuse you. The chairman managed to hide his anger. He was incensed at St. Clair's conduct throughout the investigation. Months earlier, he and St. Clair had talked privately. There is something here bigger than all of us, Rodino had told the president's lawyer. I'm not talking about a particular client or a particular committee, but about the country and the Constitution. St. Clair had agreed. Now Rodino was sure St. Clair did not see his point. His list of grievances against St. Clair was long. Rejected subpoenas, incredibly sloppy, almost criminal editing of the transcripts. The lawyer's failure to listen to all the tapes himself, his willingness to make representations to the committee without having reviewed the evidence in the White House. Rodino knew that St. Clair was embarrassed to admit that he had limited access to his client, the tapes, and other evidence. The president, Rodino reasoned, was making the legal decisions himself. St. Clair was a puppet, another arm of the bankrupt public relations apparatus in the White House. Rodino thought that a self-respecting lawyer in St. Clair's position would have quit. St. Clair gathered his papers together, then pushed his chair back and rose. He walked over and shook hands with Dorr and Minority Counsel Albert Jenner. He thought he had the case won. Not in judiciary, probably, but more likely on the House floor. And if not there, definitely in the Senate. He had stopped the stampede, he was sure. He had circumscribed the issue so that Republicans on the committee would hang on. Maybe the 3 Southern Democrats would join the 17 Republicans and kill impeachment in the committee by a vote of 20 to 18. That part was doubtful, maybe overly optimistic, yet he felt good. The safe, cautious vote would be to acquit, especially in the Senate. He had gotten the 2.5-page transcript into the record. That would be helpful in a Senate trial. A very good day, he decided. Caldwell Butler, still undecided which way to vote, recorded in his diary that evening. A very masterful presentation. If the Judiciary Committee were a jury that had to retire and deliberate and conclude its deliberation immediately, St. Clair would have carried his day. And now I'm going to stop for just a moment to show you pictures that are in the middle of the book. I'm not going to show you all of them because not all of them have, well, some of them pertain to events that will happen later in the book, but let's show you some now. Here's, let me see if there's any caption on some of these. All right, well, this one's self-explanatory. Richard Nixon, posing. Smiling. And then the next 2 pages are captioned "The Inner Circle." So at the top, so here's Chief of Staff Alexander Haig with Leonard Garment, one of the president's lawyers. So Alexander Haig, General Alexander M. Haig, Jr., Chief of Staff, with Leonard Garment, counsel to the president. We've just been reading about James D. St. Clair, another of the president's lawyers. This is St. Clair right here. And then at the bottom of this page is J. Fred Bizart, another White House special counsel for Watergate. Right here. This is Fred Bizart. And on the opposite page is General Haig in his Army regalia. And then let's see, Rosemary Woods. Okay, let me do this again. Here's General Haig in his full Army regalia, okay? And then the bottom, this is Rosemary Woods, President's personal secretary, and over here is Ron Ziegler, his press secretary. This is awkward, but I'm doing the best I can here to point these out. And then on the next page, the president's speechwriters. At the top is Raymond K. Price Jr., Ray Price. Below, at the bottom is Patrick J. Buchanan, Pat Buchanan, who became a familiar media figure in the years to come, and also ran for president against George Bush in the Republican primaries in '92. And then on the next page, three key people in foreign affairs and national security arena. At the top, Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Henry A. Kissinger. The left, Lawrence Eagleburger, Assistant to the Secretary of State. And then at the bottom, Lieutenant General Brent Scowcroft, Deputy Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, right here, Brent Scowcroft. And now, the investigation. At the top, the first Watergate Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox, who was fired in the Saturday Night Massacre in October 1973. And then House Judiciary Committee Counsel John Doerr and Chairman Peter W. Rodino Jr. So here is John Doerr, and here's the House Judiciary Committee Chair, Peter Rodino, right here. And then at the bottom of that page, Watergate Special Prosecutor Leon Jaworski, the one who followed Cox after Cox was fired, speaks to reporters and spectators outside the Supreme Court after the court ruled unanimously that Nixon must surrender the Watergate tapes. That's Leon Jaworski right there. And I'm going to stop right there, and we'll look at some more of these pictures later. And we will continue with the rest of Chapter 20 after St. Clair's testimony. We'll continue that with that hearing in the next session. So we're still in Chapter 20 of The Final Days by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. Thank you for watching.